Visual. Early morning mist over a railway yard, 1946. A low whistle pierces the cold air. It's dawn in New York Harbor. Dozens of worn rail cars wait beside a gray pier. The paint is chipped, the iron cold to the touch. Inside, rows of men sit quietly, uniforms stripped of insignia, jackets marked with 2 letters. PW. They are the last of the German prisoners of war to leave American soil. Outside, U.S. guards check lists with frozen fingers. Steam hisses from the train. Somewhere a radio crackles with swing music. Faint, almost comforting. The men inside do not cheer. Some look toward the skyline, the cranes, the warehouses, the faint shape of the Statue of Liberty in the morning fog. One man whispers to another, "If this is defeat," it felt, more human than home. For many, the war had ended months ago, but now, as the ship horns echo across the bay, another kind of reckoning begins. A journey not of escape, but of reluctant return. Because not every prisoner wanted to go back to Germany. Some wished the barbed wire had stayed closed. When the first German prisoners arrived in America, the war was still raging across 2 oceans. The year was 1943. North Africa had just fallen, and Allied transports began crossing the Atlantic not only with troops and tanks, but with captured enemy soldiers. The logic was practical. Britain was overcrowded with POWs, its camps stretched thin by food shortages and bombings. The United States, on the other hand, had vast land, secure interiors, and rail networks untouched by war. It was safer, cheaper, and far away. By the end of the war, over 425,000 German POWs would live behind American fences, scattered through nearly 700 camps across the country. From the pine forests of Alabama to the wheat plains of Kansas, they appeared almost overnight. Wooden barracks ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers, usually built beside army bases or agricultural fields. At first, the American public was uneasy. Newspapers printed photos of Nazi prisoners smiling under the sun, and letters to the editor demanded harsher treatment. But U.S. officials reminded readers of the Geneva Convention of 1929 that POWs must receive housing, food, and humane care equal to that of American troops. And so, remarkably, the camps ran on a foundation of lawful dignity. Every morning, bugles sounded at dawn. Prisoners lined up for roll call, ate hot breakfasts, and went to assigned duties: cooking, cleaning, repairing equipment, or working on farms under military supervision. For many, it was the first time they'd eaten regular meals since the early days of the Reich. Cigarettes were rationed, letters censored but delivered, and medical care was efficient. Even Red Cross inspectors noted that American camps maintained better conditions than those in most of Europe. Still, for many prisoners, stepping onto U.S. soil felt like landing on another planet. They came from a Europe in flames. Cities bombed into dust, families scattered, and morale buried under ruins. America, by contrast, was green, orderly, and alive. Roads were smooth. Towns were untouched. Children played baseball just beyond the fences. In Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas, local farmers waved at the prisoners' trucks as they drove by. Some even greeted them, offering water on the hottest days. Many POWs, some barely 19, had been taught that Americans were brutal, degenerate enemies. But the faces they saw beyond the wire didn't match the propaganda. They noticed the abundance: white bread, meat, sugar, things long vanished from German shelves. A camp in Iowa served real coffee. Another in Georgia allowed musical instruments for weekend concerts. Slowly, a paradox emerged. These were men captured in war, soldiers of an enemy nation, yet they were living under conditions more humane than many civilians in Germany. The irony was not lost on them. Some camps even organized classes. Under re-education programs like the Special Projects Division, prisoners could study English, geography, or democratic ideals. Others joined art workshops, writing clubs, or choir groups. At night, the barracks glowed with low yellow light as prisoners wrote letters home, describing a strange kind of captivity that felt, For many like a reprieve from the chaos they had once served. But beneath this calm, tensions still simmered. Hardline Nazis, known as Die Schwarzen, viewed cooperation as betrayal. They painted swastikas on bunks, burned books, and bullied those who accepted the camp's civility. For the American guards, maintaining order meant balancing firmness with restraint, ensuring discipline without cruelty. By 1944, the camps had become small, self-contained worlds, complete with newspapers, soccer leagues, and strict routines. The U.S. Army called it humane containment. The prisoners called it something else entirely. Here, one POW later wrote, "We were prisoners, yes, but we were also human again." And as the war in Europe neared its fiery conclusion, that quiet sense of humanity began to collide with the brutal reality awaiting them back home. Because soon, the ships would come again, not with prisoners arriving, but with prisoners leaving. By late 1944, the war's tides had shifted. The Allies were pushing into France, the Soviets were hammering through the east, and the once-feared Wehrmacht was bleeding out on all fronts. For the German POWs in America, the barbed wire world they inhabited began to change. Inside the camps, an invisible civil war unfolded. Not between guards and prisoners, but among the prisoners themselves. The fanatical loyalists, the true believers, still clung to the collapsing Reich. They patrolled the barracks, whispering threats, enforcing Nazi discipline. Those who showed sympathy toward Americans or questioned Hitler's leadership risked beatings, even death. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, one man was murdered by his fellow prisoners for being too friendly with the guards. The U.S. Army quietly investigated and executed 5 ringleaders. The message was clear. The Geneva Convention protected POWs, but it also demanded responsibility. Over time, the violent zealots were separated and shipped to high-security camps in the desert. The rest, the young, the exhausted, the merely obedient, began to breathe easier. The war was nearing its end. American guards relaxed. The tone inside the camps softened. Baseball diamonds replaced parade grounds. POW orchestras performed for visiting townspeople. In Camp Aliceville, Alabama, local families attended Christmas concerts where prisoners sang "Silent Night" in German and English. A quiet respect grew between captors and captives. It wasn't friendship, but it was something human. Then came May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The guards announced Germany's surrender over the camp loudspeakers. For a moment, the camps fell silent. Some men cheered, others wept. Many simply stared at the ground, realizing that whatever home meant had vanished. But America was not ready to let 400,000 enemy soldiers walk free. Transportation, debriefing, and political decisions delayed repatriation for months, even years. Many POWs spent the rest of 1945 working on U.S. farms, mills, and railroads under strict labor guidelines. Farmers praised their work ethic. "They're polite, efficient, and thankful," one newspaper reported. Towns that had once protested the arrival of German prisoners now begged for them to stay. Meanwhile, Washington debated what to do next. Britain and France requested thousands of prisoners for rebuilding projects in war-torn Europe. The U.S. agreed to transfer many of them, temporarily, under Allied control. For the POWs, that meant leaving comfortable camps for the uncertain realities of a shattered continent. Yet, even as they packed for departure, something unexpected had happened within those fences. Many of the men, once sworn enemies, had begun to rethink everything. Exposure to democratic systems, fair treatment, and honest debate challenged years of indoctrination. They listened to American news broadcasts, watched guards vote in local elections, and began asking questions that would have been forbidden back home. In some camps, newsletters printed essays criticizing Hitler's regime, cautiously at first, then boldly. In others, former Nazi officers confessed to delusion and guilt. It wasn't instant transformation, but the seeds of reckoning were there. By autumn 1945, America's war industries were winding down. Camps closed one by one, their fences dismantled. Prisoners boarded trains to ports like New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, awaiting transport back across the Atlantic. But not everyone wanted to go. Rumors spread through the barracks. Stories of bombed-out towns, families missing, entire neighborhoods erased by Allied raids. Letters confirmed it. Germany was rubble. Some men had no homes left to return to, no family, no certainty of survival in a divided land soon occupied by Americans, Soviets, British, and French. To them, captivity had become something different, a fragile sanctuary, a place where, ironically, they had rediscovered the small mercies of life: food, fairness, routine, and respect. One guard at a camp in Texas later recalled a prisoner quietly asking, "Why send us back to hell when here we have peace?" The question haunted many Americans who heard it, because behind it lay a truth few were ready to face: that in treating their enemies humanely, they had exposed the moral vacuum that had consumed those men's homeland. As the ships prepared to sail, that quiet moral paradox became impossible to ignore. 1. The human angle. To understand why so many German prisoners hesitated to leave America, one must begin with the simplest truths: food, warmth, and dignity. In wartime Germany, rations had been cut to survival levels. Bombing had shattered supply lines. Hunger was constant. Yet in American camps, meals were regular, hearty, and astonishingly varied. White bread, fresh vegetables, even meat several times a week. "It was the first time I tasted real coffee in years," one prisoner later wrote in a memoir. But it wasn't only the food. It was the way it was given. Without hatred. Guards addressed them by name, not number. Medical staff treated their wounds without resentment. Church groups sent Christmas packages. The prisoners noticed these things. To men raised on years of Nazi propaganda depicting Americans as immoral and cruel, this basic decency was disarming. Some called it hypocrisy. Others called it humanity. Even small gestures, a guard handing over a cigarette, a farmer thanking them for good work, left marks deeper than any ideology. Many POWs began to write home not about their suffering, but about their confusion. "The Americans treat us as men, not as beasts." This emotional contrast between the brutality they'd known and the fairness they now saw became the quiet revolution inside every camp. Fence. 2. The tactical, administrative angle to the U.S. Army. The mass importation of enemy soldiers had been a logistical challenge unlike any other in modern warfare. From 1943 to 1945, thousands of transports ferried German POWs from North Africa, France, and Italy across U-boat-infested waters. Each convoy carried not only men, but the political weight of humane treatment, an obligation under the Geneva Convention that the United States took seriously. Once on American soil, prisoners were distributed strategically. Camps were deliberately placed near agricultural centers and war industries, not only for isolation, but also for labor needs. The War Department's Prisoner of War labor program employed POWs in non-military tasks, harvesting crops, repairing roads, and processing lumber. This was not exploitation. It was structure. Prisoners were paid in scrip currency, which could be used at camp canteens to buy toiletries, writing paper, or cigarettes. By 1945, POW labor had quietly filled a domestic manpower gap. With millions of Americans overseas, the German prisoners had become, paradoxically, part of America's war effort. Their disciplined work impressed their supervisors. Reports noted German efficiency and precision, even under guard. A U.S. officer described them as workers who did not complain, who took pride in neatness and accuracy. But this cooperation also blurred moral lines. For many of these men, obeying orders and working diligently was a way to survive, not ideology. Yet to some Americans, particularly in rural towns, it challenged stereotypes of the enemy. Over time, shared labor bred unexpected respect. The tactical decision to treat prisoners humanely had produced an unintended outcome: the birth of mutual recognition. The ideological angle ideology dies slowly, but captivity became its quiet grave. When the first transports arrived, many prisoners were still true believers, proud, defiant, convinced of ultimate victory. They sang Nazi marches, saluted officers, and resisted any hint of re-education. But America worked differently than any propaganda film had warned. In camp libraries, shelves were stocked with translated classics: Twain, Emerson, Steinbeck. The Special Projects Division, led by American academics and psychologists, printed newspapers written by prisoners for prisoners, encouraging free debate. Articles began cautiously. Discussions on literature, music, or agriculture. Then, gradually, questions of conscience appeared. Why had Germany started this war? What had the regime really done in the East? As letters from home described bombed cities and missing relatives, the certainty of Nazi triumph crumbled. Some men began to look at their guards, ordinary American soldiers, and see not enemies, but reflections of themselves. Men who laughed, argued, and missed home. Re-education for most was not about propaganda. It was about exposure to fairness, justice, and the radical idea that authority could be questioned without fear. By late 1945, U.S. intelligence reports noted a striking change. Among younger POWs, loyalty to Hitler had collapsed. Many now spoke of democracy as something not to mock, but to understand. What began as a program of discipline had turned, quietly, into a transformation of thought. And as the end of their captivity approached, this awakening raised an impossible dilemma. If they were now changed men, what awaited them in a homeland still divided between victors and the ghosts of its own past? For many, the answer would not come from ideology at all, but from emotion, fear, and memory. The enemy, Angle 2. Most Americans, the arrival of German prisoners in 1943 had been a shock. Newspapers printed stories of Nazi soldiers being housed in local fairgrounds and cotton fields. The term enemy carried the weight of Pearl Harbor, the Atlantic convoys, and Normandy's dead. Yet face to face, the image began to shift. The guards were mostly young Americans, men from farms, factories, and cities. Many had fought in North Africa or Italy, and now found themselves watching over the same enemy they had once fired upon. But behind the wire, the prisoners looked less like monsters and more like tired men. In Camp Hearn, Texas, one sergeant recalled, "They weren't Nazis anymore. They were just boys who'd run out of war." Townspeople began to notice too. The POWs worked in fields, built barns, repaired roads. They nodded politely, learned English, even sang while they labored. Some locals were uneasy. Their sons were still overseas. Yet others began to feel sympathy. Church groups delivered books and clothing. Local children waved through the fences. By the war's end, the line between enemy and neighbor had quietly blurred. An elderly woman in Arkansas remembered later, "We'd been told they were monsters, but when they smiled and said thank you, they just looked human." For the prisoners, that simple acceptance carried enormous weight. In Germany, they had been taught to see enemies everywhere. In America, they found decency where they least expected it. That shift, the collapse of hatred through proximity, would shape their memories of captivity for the rest of their lives. The moral, comparative. Angle War exposes the character of nations. The treatment of prisoners is often its truest test. Across Europe, captivity had many faces. In Soviet camps, German POWs endured starvation, forced labor, and death by the thousands. In Britain and France, conditions were lawful but harsh. Food shortages, overcrowded quarters, and lingering resentment left deep scars. America stood apart, not because it was lenient, but because it was structured. A system built not on vengeance, but on principle. The Geneva Convention became more than a legal formality. It was a statement of moral identity. American officers were instructed that the nation's treatment of POWs reflected democracy itself, that humanity was strategic. This was not mere idealism. Officials understood that fair treatment would protect American prisoners held abroad. But beyond diplomacy, there was something deeper, a belief that cruelty corrupted the victor as much as the defeated. This moral clarity produced a paradox. The enemy received decency that many U.S. allies could not afford to give. And it worked. Reports from returning prisoners consistently described gratitude, even admiration. Many spoke of the fairness of their guards, the orderliness of the system, and the strange comfort of predictability, a kind of moral shelter in a world of chaos. Historians later noted that America's handling of German POWs became a quiet model for post-war reconstruction, proof that mercy, even in war, could yield stability. The fear, personal risk angle. But there was another reason many prisoners dreaded the journey home. Fear. Fear not of punishment by Americans, but of what awaited them in Germany. By late 1945, the homeland they once knew was gone. Entire cities lay in ruins. The Reich had collapsed into 4 occupation zones. Millions of civilians were starving. Refugees streamed westward ahead of the Soviet advance. For many POWs, returning meant entering a vacuum. No homes, no families, no certainty of survival. Worse still, rumors spread of retribution. In the Soviet zone, German soldiers were accused collectively of war crimes, regardless of rank. Thousands vanished into labor camps in Siberia. Even in the Western zones, returning soldiers faced interrogation, suspicion, and sometimes contempt from their own people. Some feared being branded as traitors simply for having surrendered. Others dreaded being sent to rebuild the ruins, under Allied orders. A handful of POWs, who had been transferred to British or French custody after America's camps closed, reported brutal working conditions, hunger, exhaustion, exposure. To those who heard their letters or testimonies, the contrast with American captivity was unbearable. That fear hardened into a wish to stay. In petitions and private letters, some prisoners begged U.S. officials for asylum or extended labor contracts. "Let us stay and work. We will rebuild here," wrote one group from a Louisiana camp. Their requests were denied. Policy demanded repatriation. But the sentiment lingered. When the orders finally came, some wept. Others made small gestures of resistance, delaying boarding, pretending illness, volunteering for extra duties that might buy time. They weren't refusing Germany itself. They were refusing to return to a world that no longer resembled home. One camp chaplain summarized it best. They had seen the enemy's humanity, and now they feared the absence of it waiting for them back home. That dread, quiet, personal, and painfully human, set the stage for the story's turning point. The moment the ships were ready, and some prisoners simply couldn't bring themselves to board. Winter, 1945, snow fell over New York Harbor like ash. Rows of German prisoners stood beside their packed duffels, the word PW fading on their jackets after months of wear. Behind them, troop trains hissed with steam, waiting to take them to the ships. The war was over. Their journey home was about to begin. But something was different. There was no relief, no celebration, only hesitation. For many, this moment, the day of freedom, felt heavier than captivity itself. They had lived as prisoners, yes, but they had lived well. They had been fed, respected, and allowed to rebuild fragments of their humanity. Now the idea of returning to a land carved up by victors, blanketed in ruins, terrified them. One eyewitness, a U.S. guard at Camp Shanks, recalled a scene that never left him. They stood there in silence. "I thought they'd be cheering to go home, but some just stared at the ground." One man bent down, scooped a handful of snow, and said softly, "Here it's clean." Across the country, similar departures unfolded. In Texas, Nebraska, and Georgia, trains filled with POWs began their long journeys east. Families gathered to watch them leave, waving farewell to the men they had once feared. A few prisoners slipped small gifts, carved wooden toys, hand-painted postcards, through the slats of the boxcars as tokens of gratitude. But not everyone boarded willingly. In several camps, men quietly refused to pack. Some feigned illness. Others begged the guards for extensions. The Army's paperwork labeled them delayed repatriations, but the truth ran deeper. They simply could not face Germany. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, officials reported dozens of written pleas. "Allow me to remain as a civilian worker. I have no home to return to. Please, let me stay in this country where I found peace." Legally, none could be granted. The Geneva Convention demanded repatriation once hostilities ended, yet the human cost of that rule was clear. A young private from Hamburg broke down as his train prepared to leave. He clutched his canteen and said to his American guard, "In Germany, I was a number. Here, I was a man again." That guard, decades later, remembered it as the moment he realized victory wasn't only about weapons or surrender. It was about who remained human when the shooting stopped. Meanwhile, Washington faced its own dilemma. Keeping the prisoners was politically impossible. Public opinion, now turning inward to rebuild post-war America, wanted the enemy gone. At the same time, Allied governments in Europe demanded manpower for reconstruction and reparation labor. By January 1946, the first major transports departed for Liverpool, Le Havre, and Bremen. Thousands of men crowded onto Liberty ships, staring silently as the American coastline faded behind them. Some wept openly. Others pressed their hands to the railings, memorizing the skyline as if trying to etch it into their minds forever. A U.S. chaplain aboard one of those ships wrote in his journal, "They didn't sing. They didn't shout. It was the quietest departure I ever witnessed." Yet in that silence, something profound lingered, a sense that the moral geography of the war had shifted. These men had come to America as enemies of democracy, indoctrinated to see compassion as weakness. They left as reluctant witnesses to a truth their leaders had denied them, that humanity was stronger than ideology. For some, the lesson came too late. Others would carry it home, to bombed-out villages and fractured families, as a fragile seed of change. But even as the ships crossed the Atlantic, not all prisoners were aboard. A few remained behind for medical reasons, administrative errors, or quiet resistance, and among them were those who would make a decision that stunned both their guards and their government: to refuse repatriation entirely. They called them the holdouts. Scattered across the heartland, Kansas, Texas, Arizona, a small number of German POWs simply refused to leave. Some pleaded with officers. Others vanished quietly into the American landscape. In the official reports, they were classified as delayed returnees or escaped prisoners. But in truth, most weren't running from anything. They were running toward something, a life that had finally made sense. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, one guard remembered a man named Friedrich Lang, a baker from Stuttgart. When the camp was scheduled to close, Lang approached the American commandant and said softly, "Please, I will work. I will stay. Germany is gone." The officer could only shake his head. Regulations were clear. All prisoners must be repatriated. Lang left in tears. 2 years later, that same guard received a letter, mailed from a Kansas farm. Lang had escaped during transfer, hidden in the wheat fields, and been taken in by a local family who refused to turn him over. He worked the land for decades, under a new name, never returning to Germany. His story wasn't unique. In Texas, a group of former POWs who had been assigned to cotton farms near Hearne and Hereford quietly remained after the camps closed. They had earned the trust of their employers, men and women who in time considered them friends. When federal marshals eventually tracked them down, most were turned in reluctantly. "He's no enemy," one farmer protested, pointing at a young man he'd come to treat as a son. "He's helped feed this town." By 1946, over 100 German prisoners were officially unaccounted for. Many were later found and deported. Some, through marriage or sponsorship, were allowed to stay. Their reasons varied, but the emotions behind them were the same: fear, gratitude, and disbelief at the contrast between two worlds. In one interview decades later, a former POW named Ernst Müller recalled stepping off the ship in Bremerhaven. "We thought home would feel like peace. It felt like punishment. Ruins, hunger, suspicion. In America, even as a prisoner, I was treated like a man. Back home, I was nothing. His words captured the essence of this paradox. That captivity in America had been, for many, their first taste of equality. Meanwhile, American officers were torn between duty and empathy. Letters from guards to Washington reflected growing discomfort with forced repatriation. One colonel wrote bluntly, "If decency is a weapon, we have won more with it than with any bomb." But orders were orders. The final ships sailed through the summer of 1946. The last German POWs left under gray skies, their departure unheralded, their faces unreadable. Some carried tiny souvenirs, a U.S. coin, a carved piece of wood, a folded photograph with American faces. For them, these trinkets were more than keepsakes. They were proof that the world they had been told to hate had shown them kindness. When they reached Germany, the shock was overwhelming. Cities lay in ashes. The trains ran through landscapes of rubble and hunger. In the Soviet zone, many were immediately conscripted into labor battalions. In the West, others were interrogated, screened, and released into nothing. No homes, no families, no work. Some began to write letters back to their old camps, to guards, to farmers who had shown them mercy. One such letter, preserved in the archives of Camp Aliceville, reads, "Here it is dark again. The people do not look up when they walk. Tell them there, in Alabama, that they taught me to believe in people again." Stories like this spread quietly through veteran circles, through church bulletins, through town whispers. By the 1950s, several former POWs had returned to the United States legally, as immigrants, laborers, even citizens. A few married American women who had met them during captivity, under Red Cross supervision. When asked why they came back, their answer was always the same: because it felt human there. That simple truth, the idea that humanity itself could be a reason to stay, became the emotional core of the German POW story. In a world still raw from war's brutality, America's restraint had created something rare: moral victory. The image of those quiet men, standing on docks or in fields, uncertain of which world was truly theirs, remains one of the war's most haunting final portraits. They had fought for tyranny, lost to democracy, and discovered that mercy was stronger than fear. And as the last ships disappeared into the Atlantic mist, the question still lingered. When a prisoner refuses freedom because captivity felt more human, what does that say about the world he left behind? When the ships finally docked in Bremen, Le Havre, and Liverpool, the men stepped onto soil that no longer felt like home. Their boots sank into mud mixed with rubble and ash. Across Germany, entire neighborhoods were gone. Streets reduced to skeletal chimneys and cratered foundations. For those who had spent years in the clean order of American camps, the return was surreal. In the United States, fences had surrounded them, but life had been structured. Here, the world was open and utterly broken. Food was scarce. Trains were unreliable. Many prisoners were processed through temporary depots before being scattered into the ruins of their former lives. Some found their homes flattened. Others discovered that their families had fled east or perished under the bombs. America was paradise compared to this, one former POW wrote in his diary in 1946. "There we had bread. Here we have ghosts." The Allied occupation authorities were determined to rebuild Germany, but they faced a moral tangle. How should these returned soldiers, men who had served Hitler yet carried stories of American kindness, fit into the new democratic order? Some were immediately pressed into Reconstruction labor. Others faced denazification tribunals that evaluated their political pasts. For many, the experience was humiliating. Public questioning, loss of rank, the slow process of re-entering a society that no longer existed. Still, something in them had changed. Having lived under democratic rules, even as captives, these men now viewed authority differently. They had seen that discipline and respect could coexist. That fear was not the only tool of control. This quiet psychological shift would ripple through post-war Germany in ways that historians later recognized as pivotal. Many former POWs became teachers, civil servants, and engineers in the new Federal Republic of Germany, shaping institutions that prized order without oppression. One American observer noted in a 1950s State Department report, "The German POWs who return from U.S. camps are often the most moderate, the most pragmatic. They saw another model of leadership, one that valued law above obedience. But for thousands of others, reintegration proved too heavy a burden. Veterans returning from the Soviet zones were gaunt, broken men. Their survival itself miraculous. Those who had known America's humane captivity felt torn between gratitude and guilt. Some tried to recreate fragments of that lost structure. In small towns, former POWs gathered in informal Amerika-Kreise, America circles, where they shared memories of the camps, the guards' decency, the camp orchestras, the steady meals. They spoke of baseball games and Sunday church services, of learning English phrases, of the moment they realized the enemy had not been the monster they were told to fear. In their stories, America became not just a place, but an idea. Even amid the ruins, they described it as a moral horizon, the proof that mercy and justice could exist together. And so, when immigration restrictions eased in the late 1940s, hundreds applied for U.S. visas. Some succeeded. They came back not as prisoners, but as settlers, workers, husbands. A few even reunited with the very families who had once employed them during captivity. Newspapers in Texas, Iowa, and Alabama ran small human interest stories. Former German POW returns to marry farmer's daughter. Ex-prisoner helps build local school. To the American public, these stories were curiosities, odd footnotes to a brutal war, but to the men themselves, they were proof that decency could outlast ideology. Still, for every man who returned to America, thousands remained in Germany, carrying within them an unspoken nostalgia for a strange, inverted truth, that in captivity they had glimpsed freedom. And as the years passed, that nostalgia would turn into something larger, a quiet legacy that reached across generations. In the years that followed, the story of the German POWs in America faded from the headlines, but it never disappeared. It lived on in letters, in reunions, in quiet visits that bridged two former enemies. By the early 1950s, Germany had begun to stand again. Factories reopened, rubble was cleared, and a new generation looked toward democracy, not dictatorship. Yet among the millions rebuilding the nation were men who had been shaped not by the Reich, but by their captors. Some of them carried small reminders from their time in America. A brass belt buckle polished clean of swastikas, a photograph with smiling U.S. guards, a notebook filled with English phrases. For many, America had become a symbol of what civilization could be after darkness. In 1955, the U.S. government officially ended its POW repatriation program. But by then, hundreds of former prisoners had already returned voluntarily, this time by choice. They arrived not in chains, but with visas, job contracts, and hope. In Midwestern towns and southern farms, old relationships rekindled. Families who had once housed POW laborers received postcards from Germany, signed with simple words, "We remember your kindness." In Aliceville, Alabama, locals organized a Friendship Day, inviting former German prisoners to return as honored guests. They walked the same roads they had once marched in line, now greeted with open arms. Some wept, others simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by the strange symmetry of it all. One man, Karl-Heinz Hölzer, returned to the same small town in Georgia, where he had picked peaches as a prisoner. He married a local woman and opened a bakery, the same trade he'd practiced behind the wire. When asked by a reporter why he came back, his answer was quiet but firm. "Because here, even in war, I felt human." It was a phrase that echoed across dozens of similar stories, from Nebraska to Texas, from Maine to California. By the 1970s, historians began to study the phenomenon formally. Reports documented how U.S. treatment of POWs had profoundly influenced post-war German democratic values. Former prisoners wrote memoirs describing America as a school of humanity. One such memoir, titled Der Zaun, war nicht das Ende. The fence was not the end, described captivity as a strange gift from fate. It was not nostalgia for imprisonment, but gratitude for dignity rediscovered. Even the American Guards remembered. Reunions were held in veterans' halls, where gray-haired men in uniform shook hands with those they had once watched over. Laughter filled the rooms, cautious at first, then genuine. They shared stories of music, of kindness, of the day the war finally felt like it was over. Today, in towns like Aliceville, Hearn, and Concordia, small museums preserve this unlikely chapter of history. Photos line the walls. Germans smiling beside Americans, barbed wire glinting softly in the sun. The captions don't speak of victory or defeat. They speak of something deeper. A brief moment when war paused long enough for empathy to breathe. Historians estimate that by 1946, more than 5,000 POWs expressed a desire to stay in the United States permanently. Only a handful succeeded then, but decades later, hundreds would find their way back, blending quietly into the very communities that once guarded them. Their stories remind us that wars may end in surrender, but humanity begins in recognition. And as old men returned to stand once more on American soil, not as prisoners, but as guests, many whispered the same thought they'd carried for half a lifetime. It felt more human than home. Their words, simple and unadorned, became the final testimony of a paradox history rarely acknowledges, that sometimes the truest freedom is found not in victory, but in mercy. Shall I write the reflection now? In the vast chronicle of World War II, a war defined by brutality, ideology, and loss, the story of the German POWs in America stands as one of its quietest, yet most profound contradictions. It wasn't a tale of battlefields or conquests. It was a story of what happens after the gunfire, when ordinary men, stripped of power and propaganda, are forced to look their humanity in the eye. Behind the wire, they found no revenge, no degradation, no humiliation, only a mirror held up by their enemies, reflecting something they had forgotten existed. Decency. The camps themselves are long gone. The barracks rotted away. The fences rusted into the grass, but their moral echo remains, in letters, in photographs, in the memories of guards who learned that discipline could coexist with compassion. For America, it was an unheralded victory, not of armies, but of values, a demonstration that power, when tempered by humanity, can rebuild even those who once sought to destroy it. And for the men who once wore the PW insignia, that mercy changed everything. It became the seed of a new Germany, the foundation of trust between two nations that would later stand side by side as allies. In a world that had witnessed the depths of cruelty, these small acts of fairness, a shared meal, a cigarette, a kind word, became testaments to the strength of moral restraint. History often remembers who won, but sometimes it's more important to remember how they won. Because in the fields of Alabama, the plains of Kansas, and the dusty yards of Texas, America proved something rare, that even in victory, you can choose humanity over hate, and for those men who refused to leave, it wasn't defiance, it was gratitude. They had come as soldiers of a fallen empire, and left as witnesses to a simple truth, that dignity, once given, never fades. The war had taught them obedience. Captivity taught them compassion. And in the end, that lesson, not the battles, became the most enduring victory of all. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the darkest chapters of war, humanity can still shine through, take a moment to keep that light alive. Subscribe for more true World War II stories told with historical accuracy and cinematic depth. I like this video if you believe that compassion, even between enemies, deserves to be remembered. Comment below, would you have left? Or stayed, if captivity had felt more human than home? History isn't just about who fought, it's about what survived when the fighting stopped. And sometimes, the greatest victories aren't written in blood, but in mercy. Fade out with archival footage of returning POWs boarding ships, dissolving to quiet farmland under sunrise. The fence is long gone,